If I was ever asked, what is your best single example of why the European Union is not good for the United Kingdom, the answer was simple: the common fisheries policy. Why? Well, under the international law of the sea, as set down in 1976 and agreed across the world, any nation has 200 miles of its fishing waters as its own exclusive economic zone for it to manage itself, or the median line. So, OK, it's 12 miles off Dover, and that under law should be ours. But it's not, because we're part of the common fisheries policy with all the other European nations, and it divides fish stocks up on the principle of equal access to a common resource. And what I've seen over these years is an industry going frankly into terminal decline, a quota system that it leads to discards, to the throwing back of dead or dying fish on an absolutely huge scale. Now, the big concern and the reason for this debate is that the government wants there to be a transition period, and all the signals we're getting are that we'll stay within the common fisheries policy, or at least within the rules-based system set by Brussels during that period. And I am concerned that if we stay in a transition for 2 or 3 years, that many, many more of what's left of our fishing industry will be forced out of business. Now, I did invite Environment Secretary Michael Gove to come onto the programme, but this was declined. I also wanted George Eustace, the Environment Minister, to come onto the show, and he also declined, but they were nice enough to send us this statement. As we have made clear, when we leave the European Union, we will leave the common fisheries policy. This gives us the opportunity to design a new domestic fishing policy, one which is in the UK's best interests and allows our industry to thrive. Yes, gentlemen, when is the question? They're not here, but I tell you who is here. Aaron Brown is here. He's a Scottish fisherman, and he's head of the Fishing for Leave campaign group. Aaron, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
My understanding is that the government say we will leave the European Union at the end of March 2019, that we may even, in theory, leave the common fisheries policy, but we are to stay during that transition period with the same Brussels-based rules system. Is that your understanding too?
Yes. The question isn't so much, do we leave the common fisheries policy? Indeed, do we leave the European Union? We absolutely do. Legally, Article 50 means we're out. It's what we do thereafter is a problem, and that's where the transition's terrifying, because as Monsieur Barnier, Monsieur Juncker have said, we will have to obey the entire acquis. For people at home, that's all EU law. So effectively, we will have left, but we will be stuck in some sort of legal purgatory where we'll be obeying the same rules. And obviously the government conveniently will have adopted all those rules with the withdrawal bill. And our big concern as Fishing for Leave is that brings us under continuity of rights, and the EU is going to nail our feet to the floor and say, you left, you had your clean slate of Article 50, you've reacceded in a new deal, which the transition's part of, and therefore you'll still obey the common fisheries policy, immigration policy, agricultural policy. And by the time we get round to this new British policy, maybe at some point in the future, as you say, there'll be nobody left, especially with choke species and a discard ban. So it's really now or never for the fishing industry, and I really think the government's dawdling and ineptitude is leading this country as a whole, not just fishing, into a seriously dangerous position.
Yeah, I think we need I have to say, I genuinely think we need to leave the common fisheries policy as soon as possible, take back our territorial waters, and not just help our industry, but also actually to do something environmentally that makes sense. You know, for years we've had talk about discards, about the throwing back of dead and dying fish. And as I saw out of Ramsgate the other day, we're still discarding fish, aren't we?
There is a discard ban, but it's not enforced yet fully. The green groups are pushing hard for full enforcement, full CCTV monitoring, and one finds it quite hard to argue with them because it is the only way to stop discards with a quota system. But the fundamental problem is banning discards is banning the symptoms, not the cause, which is quotas. And it's a quota regime that's caused all these problems, and that's why we very stridently are pushing and have developed new UK policy that will be more environmentally friendly, it'll allow fishermen to have a better living, and allow us to take that clean slate, because the discarding of fish is lunacy. So we can't environmentally or economically afford to keep the common fisheries policy going. We can't afford to do it constitutionally either.
Today, in August, out of Ramsgate Harbour on the Boy Joshua boat with Eddie the skipper. So let's rejoin Eddie on that boat as we've shot the nets. We're now about to start drawing them in. So we're hauling nets, Eddie. How's it looking?
A bit slow at the moment, but hopefully it's going to improve. We're getting one or two. Okay.
Ah, here we go. Skate, this is what we're after.
Absolutely.
But you can't catch too many.
No, and as you watch, let's say goodbye.
That's a good eating fish. Why have you thrown that back?
Well, we have a quota for the month, and unfortunately, if we keep too many, we won't be able to go fishing later in the month for something else. So you've got to, use it wise, use your quota wisely.
Will those fish survive?
Some will, some won't. It's just terrible.
But it's a terrible waste, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not something that's obviously I'm happy about doing.
So how many do you reckon you throw back a month?
Quite a few tons.
Quite a few tons?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, the trouble is, you can be fishing for soles, and if the skate are on the ground and you don't know they're there before you shoot, then you end up catching loads of skate which you've got to throw away.
Now, don't these rules need changing pretty damn quickly?
Absolutely. And they don't actually reflect what fish are on the ground.
Do you think
a lot of the quotas are they're designed for fishing that took place 30, 40 years ago, and everything's moved on since then.
Shall I invite Michael Gove to come on the boat? Would you have a few words to say to him?
Quite possibly, yes.
But yeah, we're hauling the nets and they're catching skates, and as I said earlier, fish do change over years. We've got an absolute explosion of thornback ray skates around the eastern part of England, and yet the quotas that are set annually in Brussels simply don't reflect what's out there. And when you think that boat with Eddie and his son on it, which is a boat that is just about 30 feet, just under 10 metres, when he says alone that boat is throwing back a few tons a month of skates, probably half of which are going to die and just rot on the seabed. There's something going wrong. I'm with Aaron Brown, the head of the Fishing for Leave campaign, and Aaron, you and I work very hard together to try and make fisheries a big issue in the referendum, and indeed the Wednesday before the vote. You gave us a huge hand in bringing boats together from right across the United Kingdom to come up the Thames and to parade outside Westminster. Was that an important day for your industry?
Massively so. I think without that and the help you did with the publicity for us, which was huge, that fishing would have probably been lost in the wilderness just now. However, I think the British people have always known there is something endemically wrong with fishing, that coastal communities have been devastated from our membership of Europe and sold out by Ted Heath. And I really think that it is now perceived as one of the acid tests. It epitomises the surrender of the country to Europe, and it's really going to epitomise whether we actually have a clean, successful Brexit.
It is, although there are some strong supporters of the common fisheries policy, and we met one that day, of course, didn't we, up the river, on his...
He wasn't very polite.
He wasn't very polite, was he? He was, of course, for those that don't remember, Sir Bob Geldof. And here's a little taste of what Sir Bob had to say to us.
Britain makes more money than any other country in Europe from fishing. 2. Britain has the second largest quota for fish in Europe after Denmark. 3. Britain has the third largest landings. 4th, you are no fisherman's friend. A fraud, Nigel. Go back down the river because you're up one without a canoe.
Well, there's Sir Bob, and in answer to his question, of course, when I was on the Fisheries Committee, it was non-legislative. Bob was defending the common fisheries policy, and he said that we make more money in the British fishing industry than other fleets, and we have the second largest quota. What do you have to say to Sir Bob?
Well, the thing he misses there is we should have the largest, and we should have the largest landings. Britain should be one of the premier fishing nations in the world, and we've reduced to near destitution. Just now, although we have 50% of the international fisheries zones that surround the British Isles that we share with the EU, with Norway, and just touching Faroe, although we have 50% of the waters, we only get 25% of the fish. And when you then account for the flagships that the likes of the NFFO and that represent, where they account for 75% of the domestic British fishing industry, the indigenous British fisherman's down to about 10% of his own resources. So we've had this monumental loss of our resources. As people will remember, we had big decommissioning schemes where 60% of the UK fleet was cut up. So for Bob to stand as part of the metropolitan elite and shout down, especially some of the small scale guys who are really struggling to keep a roof above their heads and keep their families going, and for him to have the temerity to stand there, I don't think it was a very gratifying sight at all.
No, it wasn't. And I know one of the Southend boats actually boarded Bob's vessel, and a couple of the Southend fishermen. And I'm surprised they didn't push him over. I'm pleased they didn't, because as it was, I think it was a giant PR victory for fishing and for the Leave campaign. As you say, Bob quoting these figures, but forgetting about the fact that actually we've given away most of what should be ours. Let's go to Carolyn, who's calling from Hull, in East Yorkshire, and Hull, Grimsby. Of course, these were, Carolyn, just a few decades ago, ports with literally hundreds of fishing boats, weren't they?
Definitely so, Nigel. My dad was a deep-sea fisherman for 45 years, and his father before that. And I've seen Hull, absolutely, it was buzzing with manufacturing, and all the docks in barrels of fish. There was very low unemployment in Hull. It was one of the main industries, and not only that, Nigel. It's not just the fishing what it has an impact on. It's all the, all the processing factories. It's absolutely destroyed the fishing industry.
I know. And what is so sickening, Carolyn, is that you could and should have 200 miles of the North Sea that should be ours to manage. And you look across, Carolyn, to the other side of the North Sea from you, to Norway, you see an industry that not only has put in place the right environmental policies, but has a thriving fishing industry. There must be a sense, I'm guessing, Carolyn, in Hull and elsewhere, there must be a sense of betrayal, effectively.
Oh, absolutely. When my dad was one of the top earners in Hull. It was never without a shaping.
Is it time, Carolyn? Is it time? Should we get out of the CFP as quickly as possible?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
You know what, Carolyn? They're getting none of it right. I've got to move on. I thank you for your call, for your passion, your family history in this industry, and a sense of betrayal that places like Hull and Grimsby feel. Nick in Sevenoaks accused me of being biased because I'm saying the common fisheries policy has been a disaster for our industry. Well, Nick, I have asked Mr. Gove and Mr. Eustace, the relevant ministers, to come on this show and to defend why we should stay in the CFP or in the CFP rules during the transition period, and they've, I'm afraid, been a no-show. And so back on to the boy Joshua with Eddie from Ramsgate. I talked about Sir Bob Geldof and the flotilla, and I wonder what Eddie's response was. Well, last year, in the run-up to the referendum, I worked with Fishing for Leave, and we organised our little flotilla up the Thames, which was a big visual spectacle, and I thought I was doing my best to encourage it all, and we were met by a guy called Sir Bob Geldof. And I just wondered what your view of Sir Bob, because Sir Bob was saying that you in the fishing community have really got a great deal out of the EU.
That is the biggest load of, what can we say, Geldofs. No, that is the biggest lie ever. We've been shafted, basically, over the years. We've been decimated, we've had our livelihoods taken away with quotas and bad science. And been really negative. And Geldof, to be honest, was badly informed and advised in what he was trying to put across.
Yeah, but the one other argument that we get about fishing is that a hell of a lot of fish caught along this coast goes to the Boulogne fish market, the massive fish market in Boulogne. And they say, well, if we left the EU, they wouldn't buy our fish. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, to be honest, if we increase the fishing limits further out, so maybe they couldn't quite get as much of our waters, then perhaps they might need our fish a little bit more, perhaps, than what they do at the moment.
Well, certainly demand for fish in Spain and France and elsewhere is a lot higher than it is here. So you're not concerned they'll still buy our fish, because otherwise where are they going to get it from?
Well, I hope that's the case, yeah.
Well, that was me out with Eddie on Boy Joshua out of Ramsgate, and you can see all the videos and shots of the nets going out, the nets coming back, what happened to the skate, the lobsters, the crabs, etc. Go to lbc.co.uk and get a feeling for how these guys earn their living. Now, I think Michael Gove, actually, who comes from Aberdeen, who comes from a family where his father was a fish merchant, I'm sure Michael Gove wants to do his best, and George Eustace represents a Cornish constituency, and hey, fishing's pretty big in that county. I'm sure they want to do their best. The trouble is, it looks like we're going to be trapped into a transition, and if we're trapped into that transition under the current rules we've got, we'll see more of our commercial fishing boats closed. I think it's urgent that we leave the CFP as quickly as we possibly can. But I want to bring in just one more environmental aspect to this, because it does matter. Fish stocks matter, rubbish in our seas matter, all of this stuff matters. You know, what we want to have is an industry that is managed properly and sensibly. Pulse fishing, and it was mentioned the other week. A lady phoned in from Lowestoft the other week and mentioned pulse fishing. Just tell us what pulse fishing is, please.
Pulse fishing is a Dutch invention. Their big fishing vessels that were fishing hard in the southern North Sea became inefficient, towing big heavy chain mats, 10 tons of chain along the seabed. And what they came up with was they would use electrical wires to tickle the fish out the bottom. And what our members, certainly in the east coast of England, are seeing is in total environmental devastation of the southern North Sea. Because, of course, it's not just electrocuting fish, it's electrocuting all the other marine life around it. And that's killing the feeding, it's killing the fish. People are retrieving fish with their insides burst out, their backs broken. It is a horrific way of catching fish, done to try and keep an inefficient Dutch industry going. There's obviously big fishing companies across there. The Dutch have a lot of flagships in Britain as well, boats that are registered here that have lobbied our government. And it's really a type of fishing that's barbaric, it's got to stop.
There are no British-owned
No.
boats conducting pulse fishing,
No.
but it's allowed to happen inside our waters because the European Commission have this as an acceptable method.
Well, the worst thing about it is it's not even an acceptable method. It was meant to be for a trial for a limited period of time for a limited number of boats, 5% of the Dutch fleet. It's now at 28% of the fleet, 100 boats, and it's been going on for 10 years. The British government has ignored it, partly because it's not on its doorstep, partly because it can't do anything about it, and big lobby groups and some environmental NGOs are culpable in this as well, have allowed pulse fishing to go on, and it has absolutely smashed the southern North Sea.
Where is Greenpeace on this? I mean, Greenpeace should be screaming blue murder.
Well, they should be.
About this. And yes, you're right. As I say, the phone call from Lowestoft we had, absolutely backing up what you're saying. I hope that once we do take back control of our territorial waters, that we ban things like pulse fishing. Would the British fishing industry support that?
Oh, absolutely. And I'd say we are far more environmentally sustainable in what the Dutch were doing. You can't replace one bad job with another. And really, the damage it's doing is incredible. Nobody in the British public would accept if we're going into fields and tasering sheep. So I don't see why we should be tasering fish either.
I'd love to see some more video of this, I really would. I mean, I may have to do another one to get to the bottom of pulse fishing.